The man who built an empire on fear couldn't spare 30 seconds for the woman who built it beside him. When Blackridge Manor exploded into a wall of fire, Ronan Viscari made a choice. His wife, the woman who bled for him, lied for him, buried her own name under his, was screaming beneath a collapsed beam with smoke pouring into her lungs. He looked at her. He looked at the staircase. And he ran upstairs. Not to save her. To save her, the other one. The one he thought held the key to everything. That decision didn't just cost him a marriage. It lit the fuse on the destruction of his entire world. If you've ever watched someone choose wrong and felt it in your chest, stay with me. This story goes all the way down. Drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see exactly how far this fire has traveled. The fire started in the East Wing at 11:42 on a Thursday night, and by the time the first security guard shouted into his radio, the basement had already gone. Blackridge Manor sat on 18 acres of gated property 40 minutes outside the city, a compound designed not for beauty, but for control. 3 perimeter walls, armed rotation every 4 hours, cameras on every entrance and every blind spot between entrances. Ronan Viscari had spent 11 years making the place impenetrable. It took someone who knew every inch of it from the inside to prove him wrong. The explosion that cracked the East Foundation came from below. A charge planted against a load-bearing column in the wine cellar detonated remotely, timed to coincide with the shift change at the south gate. Whoever did it knew the guard rotation by heart. They knew the 37-second window when the camera at the servants' entrance cycled through its dead angle. They knew that on Thursday nights, Ronan held dinner in the west dining room until midnight, and that the East Wing would be, for exactly the right amount of time, completely unguarded. The fire didn't spread the way fires normally spread. It moved with purpose. Elena Ashcroft Viscari was in the east corridor when the ceiling came down. She had been walking back from the library with a glass of water she hadn't touched, and a book she hadn't opened, because that was what Thursday nights looked like, when your husband was entertaining in a room you weren't invited into. She heard the groan before she felt it, a deep structural complaint from somewhere under the floor that vibrated up through the soles of her bare feet. And then the wall to her left buckled, and the section of ornate ceiling plaster above the arched doorway fractured and dropped. The beam caught her across the back of her left thigh and pinned her face down against the marble. She didn't scream immediately. The pain hadn't caught up to her yet. She lay there for a half-second in a kind of cold clarity, smelling smoke, watching orange light pulse at the far end of the corridor like something breathing, and thought, this is real. Then it hit her. She screamed. The marble was hot under her palms. She pushed and couldn't move. The beam had her leg pinned from mid-thigh down, and moving the wrong way sent a white flash through her vision that nearly blacked her out. She turned her head and pressed her cheek to the floor and breathed through her nose, short, sharp pulls, trying to think past the pain. Ronan. Her voice came out ragged. Ronan. She could hear shouting from the west side of the house, male voices overlapping, the distant thud of something heavy. The fire was moving through the walls. She could hear it, a low, continuous roar she'd never heard before, nothing like a fireplace or a controlled burn. This was a sound with hunger behind it. Ronan! She pushed against the beam again. It moved maybe 2 inches and then settled back with her full weight added. She wasn't moving it alone. Her fingers found the edge of the marble tile and she tried to drag herself forward toward the beam's far end, but the angle was wrong. Every inch she gained sent another wave of pain up through her hip and into her spine. The orange light was getting brighter, closer. She heard footsteps, real ones, fast, coming from the west corridor junction 20 feet behind her. And she turned her head and felt something loosen in her chest. Ronan came around the corner at a run. He was still in his dinner jacket, the collar open, and he had his phone in one hand and his eyes were already moving past her, past the beam, past the smoke, up the east staircase to the second floor. He took in the scene in the corridor the way a man takes inventory of a problem. Fast, calculating, clinical, and his eyes dropped to her for exactly 1 second. I'm pinned. She kept her voice controlled. Barely. The beam. My leg is under it. Ronan, I need help moving it. His jaw set. That look she knew, the tightening around his eyes, the slight flare at the nose, the look he wore when something was inconvenient. Security is coming, he said. They'll get you out. She stared at him. The smoke was thicker now, moving in a low ceiling above their heads. There's no time to wait for... I have to get upstairs. He was already moving. Ronan. Her voice broke on the word, not from the pain, from something worse than pain. He stopped at the base of the staircase, his back to her. The ledger is up there. He said it quietly, as if that explained something, as if the words themselves were a complete moral argument. Sienna has it. If the fire reaches that room, I am your wife. Each word came out flat and separate and exactly as heavy as she needed it to be. I am your wife, and I am on the floor, and I cannot move. He turned his head. She could see the edge of his profile, the jaw, the cheek, the cut of his brow. She had spent 12 years memorizing that profile, learning every small tell in the muscles around his eyes. She knew when he was afraid and when he was lying, and when he had already made a decision and was just waiting for the conversation to catch up to it. This was the third one. I'll send someone back down, he said. He went up the stairs. The smoke closed around the space he left behind. Elena turned her face back to the floor. The marble was burning hot under her cheek now. She could feel the heat against the right side of her face. The wall to her right was conducting it. The fire inside it somewhere, moving through the bones of the building. She had maybe 3 minutes, she thought, maybe less. She pressed her palms flat and pulled. 2 inches. 3. The beam scraped over her leg and the pain spiked so hard her vision went white at the edges. But she didn't stop. She gritted her teeth until she felt her back molars creak, and she pulled and she pulled and she got maybe 6 inches before the tears came involuntarily. Not crying, just her eyes responding to the nerve signals her body was sending, and she stopped because she couldn't see. She blinked, breathed, started again. She was still fighting the beam when she heard the steps behind her, not the polished military stride of Ronan's top security. Heavier, uneven. Someone running and not particularly trained for it. A hand grabbed the beam. She turned her head and saw a face she barely knew, one of the younger perimeter guards, a man in his mid-20s named Cole Marsh, who she had seen exactly twice in the past year. Once, when he let her car through the gate without radioing ahead, and once when she'd given him a nod in the courtyard that he'd returned with clear discomfort, like he hadn't been trained for politeness. He wasn't trained for this either. He was breathing too fast and his eyes were too wide, but his hands were on the beam. I've got it, he said. On 3. Try to pull yourself clear, yeah? She nodded. Her jaw was too tight to speak. 1. He reset his grip. 2. He lifted on 2, not 3, and she moved anyway because she'd been waiting for any movement at all, and the beam ground across her leg, and she came free in a single dragging motion that sent her sliding 3 feet across the marble on her elbows. She lay there for half a second, just breathing. Mrs. Viscari. Cole grabbed her arm and hauled her upright. Her left leg buckled and he caught her weight without comment. We need to go, right now. The east staircase, the one Ronan had gone up, was gone. The whole upper landing was orange. Fire had taken the ceiling above it and was working down the banister in a slow vertical curtain. They went west, Cole half carrying her, one arm across her back, her hand on his shoulder, moving fast through smoke that was dropping lower with every second. She could hear the manor destroying itself around them, groans and cracks, and the distant percussion of something structural giving way. She did not look back at the staircase. They came out through the kitchen entrance into the cold night air, and Elena collapsed onto the gravel driveway and pressed her face against the stones and breathed and breathed and breathed. The estate grounds were chaos. Security personnel scattered in overlapping circles of authority. Nobody in charge in any coherent way. 3 vehicles had been repositioned in the main drive. She could hear sirens in the distance. Still far, still not her problem yet. Closer, shouting, the hiss of an extinguisher being deployed somewhere useless. She pushed herself up onto her hands and looked at the house. Blackridge Manor was burning from the inside out. The east wing was already beyond saving. The west facade still looked intact. The marble columns, the tall windows, the carved stone lintel above the main entrance, but firelight pulsed behind every window on the second floor like something alive was pacing behind the glass. Someone would come for her. Someone would wrap her in something and put her in a vehicle and take her somewhere with fluorescent lights and concerned voices. She had minutes before that happened. She needed to use them. Marsh! She grabbed the guard's wrist. He'd been standing just behind her, not touching her, giving her space, which told her something about him. Which unit are you assigned to? He blinked. East Perimeter, second rotation. Were you at your post when the explosion happened? I was coming off shift. His eyes moved, a quick sideways flick that wasn't guilt so much as calculation. I heard it from the South Access Road. Who told you to come inside? Nobody. She looked at him fully then. The firelight was behind her and she knew it lit her from the back, but she didn't think it was the drama of the moment that made him hold eye contact. She thought it might just be the question itself. Nobody told you to come in, she said. You came anyway. You were screaming. She nodded slowly. Stored that. Don't report to anyone tonight, not your supervisor, not security command. If someone finds you and asks where you were helping with crowd control at the South Gate. You found your station deserted during the shift change because everyone had moved toward the fire. She held his gaze. Can you do that? He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. Not suspicion, not confusion. More like recognition of a type of conversation he hadn't expected to be having. Yeah, he said. Good. She released his wrist. Go. He went. She sat in the gravel and watched her home burn for the 40 seconds it took for one of Ronan's senior security men, a broad-shouldered Slovak named Drago Kellner, who had never once spoken to her except in service of relaying Ronan's instructions, to stride over and crouch beside her with a field medic's kit and an expression that suggested he had been told to take care of her rather than actually wanted to. Can you walk? He asked. Yes, she said. She couldn't, not well, but that wasn't his business. Mr. Viscari's instructed we take you to the secondary. Where is he now? Kellner paused. A pause she noted. He's been located, West Grounds. With Sienna Vale. Not a question. Kellner's face answered it anyway, the microscopic tightening around the eyes, the choice not to say anything, which was itself a form of saying everything. Elena stood without his help. Her left leg sent a spike of pain up her spine, severe enough to make her stomach turn, but she locked it behind her face and stood fully upright and met Kellner's eye from standing height, which meant something. She was taller than most people remembered. I need medical attention independent of anything Ronan arranges, she said. Not his doctors, not his facilities. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Kellner looked at her for a long moment. I can make a call, he said carefully. Make it. She turned back to the house. Somewhere in the upper floors, glass imploded. A bedroom window, maybe two. Firelight poured through the gap and rose in a column of heated air. She watched it without blinking. He had looked at her. She kept returning to that. The moment on the stairs when he'd paused and turned his head and she'd seen his profile, and she'd known with the certainty of 12 years that the decision was already made. He had looked at her on the floor with a collapsing ceiling and a trapped leg, and he had run the numbers, and she had come up short. Not because of the ledger. Not really. She knew enough about Ronan Viscari to know that the ledger was a story he was telling himself. A man did not abandon his wife in a burning building for a financial document. He did it because he had already been abandoning her for years, incrementally, in ways she'd cataloged and filed and told herself were the cost of the life they'd built. This was just the version with fire and witnesses, the version she could point to. She pressed her palm flat against her own sternum, counted 4 slow breaths, and made herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She did not look away from it. She let it settle into her like something permanent. Then she filed it. She would have time for the rest of it later. Right now she needed to think. The fire was not an accident. She had known that in the first 30 seconds, known it the way you know the difference between something that happened and something that was done. The pattern of it. The timing. The shift change. Whoever had built this attack had access to schedules and blueprints and a working knowledge of the security rotation that could only come from inside the organization, which meant someone in Ronan's inner circle had authored the destruction of his compound, had used the explosion and the chaos and Ronan's own predictable impulses to do it cleanly. had probably calculated correctly that when the ceiling fell, Ronan Vescari would run toward the asset and away from the liability. She wondered if they'd calculated on her surviving. The medic van that Kellner arranged arrived at the South Access Road 20 minutes later, unmarked, professional, absolutely not affiliated with any of Ronan's regular medical contacts, which told her Kellner had his own network he hadn't disclosed to his employer. She filed that too. She sat in the back of the van with a paramedic she'd never seen before, wrapping her leg and pressing a cold compress against the burns on her right palm, and she stared at the window and watched the orange glow of her house recede as they pulled away from the estate. She had her phone. She had the clothes on her back and the watch on her wrist. She had no cash and no vehicle and a leg that would keep her off her feet for at least a week. She had 12 years of knowledge about a criminal empire that she had helped build, manage, and sustain, and which its primary architect had just demonstrated he considered her expendable. She also had a name, Sienna Vale. Elena had known about Sienna for 14 months, not the way wives were supposed to find out, not a receipt, not a message on an unlocked phone, but the way Elena found out about everything, which was by paying careful attention to the world around her and assembling what it showed her without letting what she wanted to be true interfere with what was. She had seen the slight change in Ronan's scheduling, the recurring late return on the same nights each month, the particular way he moved through certain social situations when certain names were mentioned. She had confirmed it through Kellner's driver, not by asking, but by being in the car when a call came through that she wasn't meant to hear, and listening. She had not confronted Ronan. She had noted it and monitored it and given it the significance it deserved, which was not zero but also not everything. What she had not done was ask herself what Sienna Vale wanted. She was asking now. The van moved through the dark, and Elena pressed her cheek against the cold window glass and thought about a woman she'd never met, who had somehow positioned herself at the center of Ronan's empire, who had apparently convinced him she held a ledger valuable enough to justify leaving your wife to burn. The ledger. Ronan had said it himself. The ledger is up there. Said it the way he said anything he'd already decided was true. Flat, complete, not inviting discussion. She turned the word over. Ledger. In Ronan's world, a ledger meant documentation. Names, accounts, transactions. The architecture of financial relationships spanning decades of criminal operation. A document like that had value measured not in money, but in power. The power to destroy, to leverage, to negotiate from a position of total informational dominance. If Sienna Vale held something like that, she was not a mistress. She was a mechanism. And the question of who had wound her up and pointed her at Ronan Vescari's life was significantly more important than the question of whether they were sleeping together. The van stopped at a nondescript medical facility 3 cities over, the kind of place that didn't ask questions if the payment arrived in the right format. Elena was helped inside and installed in a clean private room with locks on the door and a window overlooking a parking structure, and the paramedic handed her a burner phone with 2 numbers already saved in it and said, "From Kellner," and left without elaborating. She sat on the edge of the examination table with her leg throbbing and her burned palm wrapped in gauze and the burner phone in her other hand, and she allowed herself approximately 45 seconds to sit with everything she was feeling, the fear she hadn't processed yet, the pain that wanted to take her full attention, the grief, not sharp and dramatic but low and pervasive, the way grief was when you'd been half expecting it for a long time. 45 seconds. Then she put it away. She looked at the 2 numbers on the phone. One she didn't recognize, the other had a name attached, just initials, MC, and a memory attached to the initials. A man she had met exactly once 4 years ago at a waterfront dinner Ronan had hosted for regional consolidation purposes. A man who had spent most of the evening watching the room the way people watch rooms when they're not actually there socially, and who had shaken her hand at the end of the night and held it a beat too long and said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message, "If you ever need anything that falls outside your husband's portfolio, Mrs. Vescari, anything at all, I'm reachable." She had smiled and said nothing and filed it at the back of her memory behind 1,200 more immediately relevant things. Now she turned the phone over in her hand and looked at MC, this number, and thought about what Kellner's choice to give her this number, instead of some other number meant about what Kellner believed she was going to do next. She thought about the look on Ronan's face at the base of those stairs. She thought about how long she had been managing a man who saw her as furniture. Essential, tasteful, load-bearing, but furniture. How long she had made herself small and useful and invisible to give him the space to be everything he needed to be. How long she had swallowed the knowledge of her own capability and let it sit quietly inside her like a banked fire. The manor had burned. Everything that had made her small was in that fire. She pressed the call button. The line connected after one ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I heard about the manor," MC said. No preamble, no condolence, just that, dry, direct, already moving. "Then you know what happened," Elena said. "I know what I've been told. I'm more interested in what you know." "Not on a phone," she said. "I need a location, somewhere clean, and I need at least a week of time before anyone outside a very short list knows I survived." A brief pause on his end. Not consideration. She got the impression he'd already considered most of this, more like he was placing the weight of it. "That's manageable," he said. "There's something else." She watched the parking structure through the window, a single car moving slowly between rows, headlights sweeping. "I need to know everything you know about a woman named Sienna Vale." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Elena," MC said carefully, "if you're asking that question, you already suspect this isn't about a ledger." "No," she said. "I don't think it ever was." The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll send an address." She ended the call and set the phone face down on the examination table and looked at her wrapped hand. The burns weren't deep. She'd be functional in days. The leg would take longer. She could work around both. Across the city, what remained of Blackridge Manor was still burning. Fire crews would be on site by now doing what they could, which wasn't much. The east wing was gone. The second floor was gone. Whatever the fire had decided to spare, it would spare, and whatever it had decided to take was already ash. She thought about Ronan getting out. She was sure he had. Ronan Vescari had the survival instinct of something evolutionary, something that had been choosing correctly between danger and escape for long enough that the choice had become reflex. He was somewhere right now, probably in Kellner's vehicle, probably on 3 phones simultaneously, trying to diagram what had just happened to his life. She thought about what he would do when he realized she was alive. More importantly, she thought about what he would do when he realized the ledger wasn't real. She reached for the phone again. Not to call anyone, just to hold it, to let it be the small concrete weight of what she was about to step into. She had never wanted this. She had married into money and proximity, and a certain kind of protection that felt like safety when you were young enough to confuse those things with each other. She had learned over time what it actually was, and had adjusted and adapted and made her peace with the adjustments, and then made peace with the peace, until the making peace had become its own kind of prison, invisible and personal and entirely self-constructed. But she had learned things, 12 years of things. She knew the architecture of Ronan's empire the way you know a house you've lived in for a decade. Not from blueprints, but from memory, from walking the halls in the dark without lights, from knowing which door sticks and which floorboard creaks and where the weight of the structure actually sits. She knew his allies and his debts and his favors and his fears. She knew which of his captains were loyal because they believed in him and which were loyal because the alternative was worse. She knew which of his accounts moved money in which directions and why. And she knew 3 banking relationships he had never told anyone about, not even his most trusted men, because she had found them the way she found everything, by paying attention when he believed she wasn't. She knew the name of the syndicate he'd been working to keep out of his territory for the past 3 years, the one that had been pressing against his borders with the patient inevitability of something that had time on its side. She knew it because she had read the letter he'd burned in the study fireplace on a Sunday morning in February, had read it over his shoulder through the reflection in the window glass while she stood in the doorway with coffee, and had committed the key details to memory before he turned around. She knew it. She turned the phone over and looked at MC's number again. She was going to need a great deal more than a safe house and a week of anonymity. She was going to need people. Information. Access to systems she had no direct relationship with. She was going to need to build something from nothing, in the dark, while her husband rebuilt his empire in the open, and a woman Elena had never met continued to dismantle it from the inside. It was possible. She ran the math and it was possible. It would take patience, which she had. It would take precision, which she'd spent 12 years developing without ever having a name for it. It would require her to be underestimated, which, she thought of Ronan at the base of the stairs, deciding she was not worth 30 seconds, would not be a problem. Outside the window, the single car in the parking structure had stopped. Its headlights went off. Nothing happened for a moment, and then a man in a dark jacket got out and walked without hurrying toward the building entrance below her window, and she realized MC had sent someone before she'd even called him, which meant he'd been watching the situation unfold and making preparations, which meant he was either very good or he had a significant stake in what came next that he hadn't disclosed. Possibly both. She stood. Her leg protested. She stood anyway, and she crossed to the window and she looked down at the man in the dark jacket who had stopped on the sidewalk below and tilted his head up toward her window as if he'd known exactly where she'd be. He gave a single small nod. She did not nod back. She held his gaze for a moment, long enough to make clear that she was doing the evaluating here, and then she stepped back from the glass. Down the hall, somewhere in the facility, a door opened and closed. She picked up the burner phone, turned off the light in the room, and sat in the dark and waited. Not passively. Not the way she had spent 12 years waiting, which was a kind of slow erosion. She waited the way you wait when you know exactly what's coming and you've already decided what you'll do when it arrives. The footsteps came down the hall. She breathed. She was still breathing when the knock came. 3 light taps, professional, not announcing strength but precision. And she crossed the room on a damaged leg without making a sound, and she put her hand on the lock, and she paused there for just one moment. In the east wing of what had been Blackridge Manor, the last of the ceiling was giving way. Ronan's curated world collapsing in slow structural failure, each beam going when the heat reached it, the whole architecture of a life built on control and fear and the assumption that some people mattered and some people didn't. Finally, irreversibly, coming down. She unlocked the door. The man's name was Declan Marsh, not Cole Marsh, not the perimeter guard who had pulled her from the beam, though the shared surname was something she noted and set aside for later. Declan was older, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been arranged by decades of careful stillness into something that gave nothing away. He wore the dark jacket she'd seen from the window and carried nothing visible in his hands, which told her the things he was carrying weren't visible. He stood in the doorway of the unlit room and looked at her standing in the dark, and did not reach for a light switch. MC sends his regards, Declan said. MC can send them in person. She stepped back and let him in and closed the door behind him. Who are you to him? Logistics. That's not an answer. It's the one I was told to give. He moved to the window. Not to look out, she thought, but to position himself with the glass at his back. Old habit. There's a vehicle downstairs, clean plates, full tank, a bag in the trunk with what you asked for. I didn't ask for anything. I made one phone call 20 minutes ago. MC. Anticipated. He said it without apology. Without warmth either. Just fact, delivered flat. He's been watching the Viscari situation for some time. She absorbed that. How long? Long enough that when the manor went up, his first call was about you, not your husband. She crossed her arms. Not defensively. The posture of someone running calculations in real time and not wanting to be interrupted by their own hands. What does he want from me? Declan looked at her steadily. Nothing you aren't already planning to do. That's a very careful way of saying he wants to use me. He wants to work with you. There's a distinction. There isn't usually. She uncrossed her arms and moved toward the door. Where are we going? Safe house, 40 minutes north. Off-grid, owned through 3 shell layers, never connected to MC or anyone your husband would recognize. He paused. Your leg needs proper treatment before you move too far. My leg is my business. She pulled the door open. Let's go. He didn't argue. She noticed that too. The vehicle was a gray sedan, unremarkable, the kind of car that existed specifically not to be remembered. Declan drove and Elena sat in the back, not because she felt entitled to it, but because it gave her the full rear window and both side mirrors in her sightline simultaneously. Old instinct, not from danger, from 12 years of watching how men like Ronan moved through space and absorbing the underlying logic of it. They drove north in silence for 11 minutes before she spoke. "Sienna Vale," she said. "What do you know?" Declan's eyes moved to the rear view, a brief check, reading her or checking the road behind them, probably both. "She came into your husband's orbit approximately 18 months ago. Social introduction through a maritime broker named Fells, who runs clean money through 3 Eastern European port authorities. Fells has no direct syndicate affiliation on paper. But Fells has been connected to Halcyon Group assets for about 4 years. Secondary connections, difficult to prove. The kind of thing that takes patient documentation." She felt the word land. "Halcyon. You know it." Not a question. She didn't answer it as one. "I know the name. I know what Ronan thought of them. What's their actual structure?" "International. Old money that learned new tricks. They operate through acquisition rather than confrontation. They don't take territory by force. They engineer situations in which the existing power structure collapses, and then they move into the vacuum." Declan's voice carried the flat cadence of someone reciting documented fact. "They've done it in 4 regions in the past 6 years. Never the same method twice." Elena looked out the window at the dark highway. "And Sienna is their mechanism here." "We believe so. We can't prove the direct connection yet, but the pattern fits. The access she's gained to your husband's inner operations, the speed of it, the way she positioned the ledger as her value proposition." He paused. "The ledger doesn't exist." "I know." A beat. "You knew before tonight?" "I suspected." She watched a highway sign pass. "Ronan is a man who needs to believe he's getting something. He's generous with access if he thinks he's building toward a prize. Sienna gave him a prize to build toward." She turned from the window. She let him believe he was managing her when she was managing him the entire time. Declan said nothing for a moment. Then, "MC will want to hear your read on the internal structure. Who's loyal? Who's movable? He'll hear it when I decide he should." She held the rearview mirror's reflection of his eyes. "I'm not a source, Declan. I'm not an asset. If MC wants to work with me, he works with me. Not around me, not through me, with me." The eyes in the mirror stayed steady. "Understood." "Does he understand it?" "He will," Declan said, "when I tell him how you said it." The safe house was a converted farmhouse set back from a secondary road behind a tree line dense enough to disappear a building. Inside it was plain and functional. Good lighting, clean surfaces, a fully stocked medical kit in the bathroom, and food in the refrigerator that had been bought recently enough to still be cold. Someone had prepared this space before the fire. Before, or very quickly after, with a speed that implied preparation. She treated her own leg in the bathroom with the kit, sitting on the edge of the tub with her jaw locked against the pain of cleaning the lacerations properly. The bruising was extensive, the full left thigh a deep pattern of purple and red that would take weeks. Nothing broken, she was reasonably certain. She wrapped it herself, tight and even, and took 2 of the painkillers in the kit, just 2, because she needed to think. She came out to find Declan at the kitchen table with a laptop open and a phone to his ear. He ended the call when she appeared. "MC?" she asked. "Kellner." She stopped. "Kellner called you." Kellner has been working adjacent to MC's interests for about 8 months. Declan watched her process this without expression. He flagged the shift change anomaly 3 weeks ago, the gap in the South Gate rotation that shouldn't have existed. He didn't know what it meant at the time. Elena sat down across from him. Her leg throbbed under the table. He knew something was wrong with the estate's security. He suspected he didn't have enough to bring to your husband without risking his own position if he was wrong. So he sat on it. He made preparations. Declan turned the laptop slightly to face her. On the screen, a security log, timestamps, camera feeds cross-referenced against guard position records. He's been documenting irregularities in the rotation for 6 weeks. 3 other men in the security detail have shown behavioral flags: unexplained absences during key windows, encrypted communications on personal devices during working hours. She looked at the screen, then at Declan. He built a case. He built a record. It's not a case yet. A pause. He also wants to know if you're all right. Something in her chest moved. She ignored it. Tell him I'm functional. Tell him I need the names of the 3 flagged men in the security rotation and any contact information for their outside communications, if he has it. She paused. And tell him his instinct about tonight was correct. He should trust it. Declan typed. Sent. They sat in the quiet of the farmhouse for a moment, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind against the tree line outside. Ronan, she said. Where is he now? We have him at a secondary property he maintains under a holding company in the East County. He arrived approximately 90 minutes ago with Sienna Vale, 2 senior captains, and a reduced security contingent. Declan checked his phone. He's been making calls, a lot of calls. He's trying to reassemble the command structure. She could see it clearly. Ronan in a room somewhere, jacketless now, sleeves rolled, working the phone with the particular focused energy he had in crisis situations, the energy that had made her believe in him once. He would be doing what he did best, projecting confidence into a vacuum, convincing people the situation was recoverable, making them feel the gravity of his certainty. How many of his captains have responded? 3 of his 8 primary contacts have gone dark. 2 have confirmed they're coming in. The remaining 3 are pending. The 3 who've gone dark. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking. Caro, Voss, and either Petrov or the man they call Bishop. Declan looked at her. Caro and Voss, yes. The 3rd is Petrov. Petrov. She filed the confirmation. He's been unhappy for 2 years. Ronan cut his territory during the Northern Consolidation and never compensated him properly. He stayed because the alternative was worse, but he's been positioning. If Halcyon reached him through the right channel, she stopped. He wouldn't need much convincing. You knew Petrov was a vulnerability. I knew Ronan didn't take him seriously enough. There's a difference. She brought her eyes back to Declan's. Ronan doesn't take most people seriously enough. It's the thing that made him effective and the thing that's going to finish him. Declan studied her for a moment. Something had shifted in his face. Not warmth, but a kind of recalibration. The expression of a man who had come into a situation with a certain set of expectations and was quietly updating them. He closed the laptop and sat back. MC wants to meet. Tomorrow, if your leg allows. My leg will allow. She straightened in the chair. But I want something first. Name it. Everything MC has on Halcyon Group. Not a summary, the actual documentation. I need to understand the full structure before I sit across from anyone and decide what I'm willing to share. Declan pulled a USB drive from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. She looked at it. You were going to give me that anyway. MC said to give it to you if you asked for it in the first 30 minutes. A very faint shift at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but its structural cousin. You took 22. She picked up the drive. Get some sleep, Declan. We move early. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the laptop and the USB drive and 4 hours of uninterrupted silence, and she read everything MC's organization had assembled on Halcyon Group, and what she found was worse than she'd expected and more coherent than she'd feared, which somehow made it worse than worse. Halcyon was not new. They had been operating in one form or another for over 2 decades, evolving their methodology as the landscape changed around them. In their early period, they had been primarily financial, laundering infrastructure, investment vehicles, the kind of operation that touched criminal proceeds without getting visibly dirty. But somewhere around 15 years ago, they had shifted, started taking active positions, started engineering outcomes rather than just servicing them. The 4 regional collapses Declan had mentioned were all in the file. She read them in sequence, looking for the pattern, and by the 3rd one she had it. Halcyon never moved against a power structure directly. They found the vulnerability at the center of it, always a person, always someone the primary operator trusted implicitly. And they exploited it, slowly, carefully, over months, sometimes years. They were patient in a way that most criminal organizations weren't, because most criminal organizations were built on urgency, and Halcyon was built on something older and colder than urgency. They were built on the understanding that powerful men had predictable weaknesses, and that a beautiful woman positioned correctly could become architecturally indistinguishable from a support beam, right up until the moment she wasn't one anymore. She set the laptop down and sat with that for a minute. Sienna Vale had been inside Ronan's operation for 18 months. 18 months of access, of information flow, of learning the pressure points and the load-bearing relationships, and the places where trust was thinnest. 18 months of feeding Ronan exactly what he needed to believe to keep moving in the direction Halcyon needed him to move. And all of it wrapped in the ledger, the fiction of the ledger, the promise of documentation that would give him total dominance over every competitor in his territory, dangled just far enough ahead that he kept reaching. She thought about the night she'd stood in the doorway of the study and watched him burn that letter. She thought about his face at dinner parties when Sienna's name came up in adjacent conversation, the careful neutrality he wore, which was its own kind of tell. She thought about 18 months of small choices she'd watched him make that had seemed like the ordinary drift of a man with too much power and not enough friction, and now she reread them against what she knew, and they rearranged themselves into something with a clear direction. He had been walked off a cliff one careful step at a time by someone who understood exactly how he moved. She could have told him. That was the thing she kept returning to as the hours passed and the house stayed dark and quiet around her. She had known, or known enough, and she had kept her silence because… why? Because it wasn't her business? She had made herself not his business for so long that the habit had outlasted its usefulness. Because confronting it would have required admitting how much she'd already lost? She pushed the thought away. It was accurate, and it was useless, and dwelling on it served nothing. At 4 a.m, her burner phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "He's asking about you." She stared at it, typed back. "Who is this?" The response came in under 30 seconds. "Kellner, second phone. He's asking Drago if you made it out." Drago doesn't know I'm watching the conversation. She processed that. Kellner watching his own superior officer. The layers were compounding. "What did Drago tell him?" she typed. "That you were treated and transferred. Didn't say where." Viscari pushed. "Drago said he lost the thread during the chaos." A pause, then, "He believed it. Or pretended to." She set the phone down, picked it up again. "Is she with him?" "Yes." "Does she know about me?" The reply took longer this time. Long enough that she thought Kellner might not answer. Then, "She told him not to worry about you, said you weren't a factor." Something cold moved through Elena's chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something more structural than anger. The kind of cold that comes when you understand exactly how small you've been made in someone else's accounting of the world. "Not a factor," she typed. "Good. Keep it that way." She put the phone face down and went back to the laptop. By 5:30, she had built a preliminary map. Mental first, then written in a plain text document she'd encrypted with a password Declan didn't have. Halcyon's structural connections as she understood them. The confirmed assets, Fells the maritime broker, the 3 flagged security men inside Ronan's detail, almost certainly Petrov. The probable assets, 2 of Ronan's financial contacts who had shown anomalous behavior over the past year that she'd logged without knowing why. The unknowns, whoever had physically planted the charge in the wine cellar, and whoever inside the estate had provided the detailed timing information needed to execute it. That last category was the critical one. Planting a charge in a secured basement required either access or someone who could provide it. And she didn't think that person was in the flagged security rotation. Too obvious, too exposed. Whoever had enabled the physical breach had done it cleanly enough that Kellner's 6 weeks of documentation hadn't caught them, which meant there was someone she hadn't identified yet. She was still turning that over when Declan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6 a.m., looking like a man who had slept precisely as much as he needed to and not 1 minute more. "MC moved the meeting," he said. "He's coming here." She looked up. "Why?" "He says the situation moved faster than he expected overnight." Declan crossed to the coffee pot and started it without being invited to. 3 things. Caro turned up. Not dead, which was the first possibility, but gone. Completely out of pocket. His family relocated 2 days ago, before the fire. He knew, Elena said. He knew. Second, Ronan's financial infrastructure is showing movement. Accounts connected to the primary operating fund started transferring out in small increments starting around 2 a.m. Someone with deep access is bleeding the pool. She felt the implications of that settle. Sienna. Possibly. Or someone she's given access to. Declan poured coffee and set a mug in front of her without asking if she wanted one. Third thing, the security man who helped you out of the building last night. Cole Marsh. She went very still. He reported in to his supervisor at midnight, per your instructions, consistent cover. But at approximately 3 a.m., he made contact with someone outside the Viscari network. Declan's voice stayed even. The contact was a Halcyon-affiliated number. She looked at him. We don't think he knew what he was contacting, Declan said carefully. The number was dressed as a legitimate private security firm, but Halcyon now knows someone helped me out of the building. She was already moving through the implications. They know I survived because someone inside the estate chose to come back for me. If they dig into it, they'll identify him within hours. They may already have. She stood up. Her legs screamed at the sudden movement, and she ignored it completely. He needs to be moved, now, before whoever is running Halcyon's ground operation figures out what he did and decides he's a loose thread. MC is already, now Declan. Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she didn't soften it. He's 25 years old, and he came back for me because he heard me screaming. He doesn't get to pay for that. A beat of silence. Declan looked at her steadily. Something moved in his expression. Not judgment, she thought. Recognition. I'll make the call, he said. He left the kitchen. She stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed through the pain in her leg and thought about a young man with wide eyes and unsteady hands who had lifted a beam without being asked and set on 3 and lifted on 2. She thought about debt. The real kind. Not financial, not transactional. The kind that doesn't get retired with a payment but with a choice, made again and again, to act in accordance with what someone once did for you. She would not let Cole Marsh become collateral. She was still standing like that. Hands flat, jaw set, working through the logistics of keeping a 25-year-old guard alive when she didn't yet have the infrastructure to protect anyone. When the front door opened and a man walked in that she recognized immediately, despite not having seen him in 4 years, because some people have a quality of presence that doesn't diminish in memory. MC, Marcus Cavell, though she had only ever heard the initials used, was in his late 50s, lean with gray at his temples, and the kind of deliberate stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where reacting too fast gets people killed. He was dressed simply. He carried nothing. He stood inside the farmhouse door and looked at Elena Viscari, at the wrapped leg, the burned hand, the sleepless eyes, the posture that refused to accommodate any of it. And he said, "You look terrible." "I feel precise," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. Declan positioned himself at the kitchen counter, present but peripheral, which she suspected was his natural position in most situations. Cavell looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way people look when they're deciding how much they already know and how much they want to appear to know. Then he said, "The Halcyon exposure is accelerating faster than I modeled. Ronan has maybe 72 hours before his entire financial foundation is compromised." 60 hours, she said. The account movement started at 2 a.m., and whoever is running it knows what they're doing. They won't bleed slowly once they're confident the structure is weakened enough. Cavell studied her. "You've been in the files." "I've been awake." She folded her hands on the table. "I need to tell you what I can offer and what I won't, so we don't waste each other's time." "Go ahead." "I have working knowledge of Ronan's complete financial architecture, primary accounts, secondary accounts, the 3 off-book relationships he's maintained outside his known banking structure. I have contacts inside his distribution network who were loyal to the operation rather than to him personally, and who will be looking for direction once the structure starts to visibly fail." She paused. "I have documentation. Not a ledger. I'm not in the business of fiction. But I've been building a quiet record of my own for the past 3 years, because I am a woman who has lived in proximity to a great deal of illegality, and I have always understood that the day would come when I would need to account for what I knew and what I'd done with it. Cavell's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. You built your own insurance. I built a record of what I witnessed. There's a difference. She held his gaze. What I won't do is hand it to you wholesale and step back. I direct how it's used. I decide the timing. If you bring in law enforcement, it happens on my timeline with protections I've negotiated in advance. I am not a source, and I am not an informant. I am a partner, or I am gone. The kitchen was quiet. Declan's coffee cooled on the counter. Cavell looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded, once, the kind of nod that meant the conversation had just changed levels. There's something you need to know, he said, before we go further. Tell me. The person inside Ronan's estate who enabled the physical breach, who provided the timing data and the access for the charge placement, he paused. We identified them this morning. She waited. It was someone in the household staff, a woman named Reyes who has been in your husband's domestic employ for 3 years. Cavell's voice stayed neutral. She was recruited by Halcyon 11 months ago. She was activated 6 weeks ago when the operation moved into its final phase. Elena said nothing. She was also, Cavell continued, one of 4 domestic staff members who reported directly to you rather than to your husband's household manager. She worked in your household specifically. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. Elena felt the information land in layers. The factual layer first, a woman named Reyes, 3 years, activated 6 weeks ago, and then the implication layer underneath it, which was heavier and colder, that Halcyon had reached inside her own household, had placed an asset in her direct orbit, had been, for 11 months, watching her through someone she'd trusted with proximity to her daily life, had been watching her watch Ronan. She breathed, slow, controlled. Where is Reyes now? She asked. Gone. She left the estate during the evacuation chaos. We have a vehicle ID and a direction. North or south? Cavell looked at her. South. How did you... Because south is the direction of the port, she said. And if Halcyon used Fells as their introductory channel, they use maritime infrastructure for their extraction routes. She stood up. The leg was a wall of pain, and she moved through it. We need Reyes before Halcyon pulls her out of the country. She's the direct link between the physical operation and whoever ran it, and once she's on a boat, she's gone. She looked at Cavell. Tell me you have someone who can move on a port in the next 6 hours. Cavell stood too. The stillness in him had shifted into something kinetic and directed. I have people, he said. Then we need to move. She crossed the kitchen toward the door, uneven on the damaged leg, but not slow. And Cavell? He stopped. Cole Marsh, she said, the guard who pulled me out. He needs to be somewhere safe before nightfall. That's not a negotiating point. That's the condition under which I walk out this door with you. Cavell looked at her for one moment, just one. And in that moment she saw him make the full calculation of who he was dealing with and what it would cost him to underestimate her. Done, he said. She opened the door into the gray morning, and the cold air hit her face, and somewhere south of them, in a port facility still slick from last night's rain, moving toward a shipping container that would carry her out of the country and away from everything she'd helped build and destroy, a woman named Reyes was running and didn't yet know that the person coming after her was not Ronan Viscari's man. It was his wife. The port smelled like diesel and salt and something older underneath both. The particular decay of a working waterfront that never fully dried out, where the wood pilings had been rotting incrementally for decades, and the water between them carried a greenish opacity that suggested things best not examined. Elena moved through it on a leg that had stiffened badly in the cold morning air, Declan 2 steps behind her, and one of Cavell's port-side contacts, a compact woman named Rue, who knew every camera blind spot in the facility by memory, walking point 20 feet ahead. They had come in through the maintenance access on the facility's western edge, through a gate that Rue had opened with a keycard that wasn't supposed to exist, and they had 40 minutes before the shift supervisor's next walkthrough made their presence in this section of the port impossible to explain. Cavell was not with them. Cavell was coordinating from a vehicle parked 2 blocks from the facility entrance, managing 3 phone lines simultaneously, because the operation to locate Reyes inside a working port with 6 active shipping terminals and approximately 400 people moving through it on early shift required someone who could see the whole board at once. Elena was not interested in seeing the whole board. She was interested in one specific piece on it. Container Terminal 3, Rue said quietly, not turning around. Vehicle matching the ID came in through the south freight entrance at 4:40 a.m. Driver logged a delivery manifest for a refrigerated unit bound for the Adriatic. Manifest was filed 2 weeks ago. Prepared, Elena said. Long before the fire. Yeah. Rue moved around a stack of pallets without breaking stride. She wasn't improvising last night. She had an exit built. Elena had known that, logically, since Cavell told her Reyes was gone, but hearing it stated plainly in the cold morning air gave it a different texture. 11 months of preparation. 11 months of a woman moving through her household, pouring her coffee, managing her calendar, learning her patterns, and building, underneath all of it, a careful architecture of exit. She felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not quite betrayal. Betrayal required a certain kind of investment in the relationship it violated, and she hadn't been invested in Reyes beyond the ordinary trust of an employer. More like the particular chill of understanding how completely she'd been observed, how thoroughly someone had mapped her while she was busy mapping everyone else. She filed it. Moved. Terminal 3 was a landscape of stacked containers, 40-foot steel boxes arranged in columns 8 and 9 high, color-coded by shipping company, the early light turning everything the same shade of industrial gray. The refrigerated units were on the eastern edge, closest to the loading dock, humming with continuous power from the facility grid. There were 11 of them in current holding. The manifest Rue had accessed showed one was scheduled for loading in approximately 3 hours. They found Reyes in the space between containers 7 and 8. She was sitting on an overturned plastic crate with a phone in her hand and a bag at her feet, and she heard them coming despite Rue's practiced quiet, because Reyes had spent 3 years in a house with a man who valued security above almost everything, and some of that had apparently transferred. She was on her feet before they were fully around the corner. She was younger than Elena had registered in the ordinary course of their domestic arrangement. 28, maybe 29, dark-haired, slight, with the kind of face that composed itself quickly and gave nothing away on demand. She was giving nothing away now. The phone disappeared into her jacket pocket. Her hands came clear, and she looked at Elena with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite resignation, but something between them that Elena recognized as the face of someone whose exit timeline had just been compromised and who was already running alternative routes. The 3 of them formed a loose arc. Reyes looked at each face in turn. Her eyes came back to Elena and stayed there. Mrs. Vescari, she said. Her voice was completely steady. You don't have to do that, Elena said. The name. A small pause. Elena, then. How long did they have you watching me specifically? Reyes said nothing. Not a rhetorical question. Elena took a step closer. Not aggressive, deliberate. Closing the conversational distance. I know Halcyon placed you. I know you were activated 6 weeks ago for the physical operation. I know the timing data you provided is why the charge placement worked. What I don't know is whether your surveillance of me was incidental to your position in the household or whether you were placed in my household specifically because of me. Something moved across Reyes's face, a calculation of what honesty cost against what silence cost. Elena watched her run it. You specifically, Reyes said finally. The cold moved through Elena's chest again. She kept it off her face. Why? Because you were the variable they couldn't model. Reyes's voice had shifted, still controlled, but carrying something underneath it now that might have been, in another context, something like professional respect. Your husband was predictable. His captains were predictable. The financials, the security rotation, the relationship with Vale, all of it mapped cleanly. You didn't map. So they put someone in my house to map me, to determine whether you were a threat or a non-factor, a beat. The initial assessment was non-factor. You stayed in your lane. You didn't ask the wrong questions overtly. You managed the domestic infrastructure and you maintained the social calendar and you appeared. She stopped. Appear to be what I was supposed to be, Elena said flatly. Reyes met her eyes. Yes. And then the assessment changed. The pause was longer this time. Rue shifted her weight slightly to Elena's left. Not threatening, just present. Declan hadn't moved at all. 8 weeks ago, Reyes said, you made a call from a phone I didn't know you had. Elena went very still. A burner. You used it twice, both times from the estate, both times late at night when the household was quiet. The calls were short, and the number you contacted didn't appear in any of our existing mapping. Reyes's voice was precise, the voice of someone recounting documented fact, which meant she'd filed a report, which meant Halcyon had that information. I couldn't identify the contact, but the existence of a secondary phone you'd never disclosed told us something about the level of preparation you'd been operating with. Elena's mind was moving very fast beneath the surface she kept completely still. 8 weeks ago. She had used the burner twice, once to confirm a meeting with a financial contact she'd been cultivating independently, once to verify that a specific document she'd placed in external storage had been received and secured. Routine, careful. She had been certain no one had seen her. They changed my threat assessment, she said. They flagged you as a potential complication. Reyes's jaw tightened slightly, the first real crack in the composure. The original plan did not include what happened to you in the corridor. The beam, the fire in the east wing, the ceiling coming down. Elena looked at the younger woman for a long moment. The charge in the wine cellar wasn't supposed to take the east corridor ceiling. The structural modeling had the failure contained to the east wing below the first floor. Something shifted in Reyes's face. Not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of someone who has been precise in their own mind about a distinction the world didn't ultimately honor. The load-bearing column had secondary connections we didn't account for. When it went, it transferred the stress. It transferred the stress to the corridor ceiling. Elena's voice came out very quiet. Where I happened to be walking. Reyes said nothing. Did they know I was in that corridor? A longer pause, the longest yet. Yes, Elena breathed through her nose. Once. She looked at the stack of containers over Reyes's shoulder, at the gray steel faces of them, the stenciled numbers, the rust lines at the corner seams, and she let that land fully before she spoke again. They knew I was in the corridor, she said, and they proceeded with the detonation. The operation window was fixed. Deviation would have compromised. I'm not asking you to justify it. The quiet in her voice had a quality now that wasn't anger and wasn't grief. It was something colder and more structural than either. I'm establishing what happened, what was decided, and by whom. Reyes looked at her. The composure had come back, the professional mask, the careful neutrality. But underneath it, Elena could see something that looked like the beginning of a reevaluation. The look of someone who had come into a situation understanding it one way and was finding that understanding insufficient. Who runs the ground operation? Elena said. Here, in this city. Not the Halcyon board structure. I have that. The person who made the call on the detonation timing when they knew I was in the corridor. Reyes said nothing. Her eyes moved to Declan, to Rue, back to Elena. You're not getting on that ship, Elena said simply. That's already settled. The question you need to answer for yourself is what happens next. Halcyon will not send someone to recover you. They'll send someone to close the thread. You know that. You've known it since we came around that corner. She paused. I'm the only option you have that doesn't end in a container bound for the Adriatic that never gets opened at the other end. The silence between them was long and specific. The silence of a decision being made under conditions that stripped away most of the available choices and left only the honest ones. His name is Gregor Saud, Reyes said. He runs Halcyon's Western European and North American ground operations out of a rotating base. He's been in this city for 3 weeks. He's the one who made the call on the timing. Where is he now? I don't know his current location. I had a contact number and a protocol for check-in. I was supposed to check in at 6 a.m. today from the ship. She checked the time. An automatic gesture, the motion of someone whose life had been structured around schedules for long enough that crisis didn't fully interrupt it. I'm 40 minutes overdue. Which means he knows something went wrong, Declan said from behind Elena. Which means he's already adjusting, Elena said. She looked at Reyes. Check-in protocol. What does it look like? A text. One word. The word changes on a weekly rotation. This week it's meridian. Elena held out her hand. Reyes looked at it, looked at Elena's face. Then she took the phone from her jacket pocket and placed it in Elena's palm. Elena handed it to Declan without looking at him. Send it, then pull the battery. She kept her eyes on Reyes. It buys us an hour, maybe less, before he expects a follow-up. We need to move. They moved. Cavell's vehicle was a black SUV with tinted windows and a scanner running on the dashboard that Elena didn't ask about. Reyes sat between Declan and Rue in the back seat, her bag at her feet, her hands visible on her knees in the posture of someone who had made a choice and was now inhabiting the consequences of it. Elena sat in the front passenger seat. Cavell drove. He had listened to Elena's summary of the Reyes conversation without expression, which he was beginning to understand was his standard mode of receiving information he'd already partially anticipated. When she finished, he said, Gregor Sote. And it wasn't a question. You know him, she said. I know of him. He operated in the Baltic Theater about 6 years ago. We had intelligence placing him in 2 regional collapses that fit the Halcyon pattern, but we couldn't build a direct evidentiary connection. He was quiet for a moment, navigating the port exit. He's meticulous, patient. He doesn't move on anything until the conditions are precisely what he needs. He's been in this city for 3 weeks, Elena said. That means the Blackridge operation was his final phase. Everything was already in position. Which means Sienna Vale's timeline with your husband has run its course, Cavell said. She's not there to maintain the access anymore. She's there to manage the extraction. Elena turned that over. She's pulling the financial assets out and positioning herself to disappear with them. That's our read, yes. Cavell made a turn onto a surface road, the port falling behind them. The account movements that started at 2 a.m. We've been tracking them. 3 of Ronan's primary operating accounts have lost approximately 40% of their liquid assets in the past 4 hours. The transfers are moving through a chain of shell structures that dead-end in accounts we can't identify from our current position. I can identify them, Elena said. Cavell glanced at her. 2 of the 3 off-book accounts Ronan maintained outside his known banking structure, she said. I told you I had documentation. Part of that documentation is the routing architecture for those accounts. If Sienna is pulling assets into a blind chain, I'd be willing to bet the terminus connects to at least one of those structures. She paused, which means she had access to information about those accounts that Ronan never gave anyone. Someone gave it to her, Cavell said, or she found it herself. Elena looked at the road ahead. Or someone who had been inside the operation long enough to find it gave it to her without realizing what it would be used for. She stopped. The thought arrived the way the worst thoughts arrive. Not with drama, but with the flat, factual inevitability of something that was always going to be true, waiting for you to be ready to see it. She turned around in her seat. Reyes, her voice came out measured and even. How long have you been feeding information to Halcyon? 11 months, Reyes said. I told you. I know what you told me. I'm asking something more specific. Elena looked at her carefully. Ronan has 3 off-book accounts. Did you know about them? Reyes held her gaze. No. Household staff doesn't have access to financial. I'm not asking about access. I'm asking about knowledge. Elena waited. Did you ever report to your Halcyon contact about conversations you overheard, about documents you might have seen in proximity to, about anything financial that came through the household in the course of your duties? The pause was too long. Reyes. There was a document, Reyes said. Her voice had lost some of its precision. 8 months ago, I saw it on the desk in the West Study. I photographed it as part of my standard reporting. What did it contain? I'm not a financial analyst. I photographed everything that seemed relevant and filed it. I didn't know what was significant and what wasn't. Elena felt the full shape of it now. But Halcyon did. Silence. The document you photographed 8 months ago gave Halcyon access to Ronan's off-book routing architecture, Elena said. Not a question. And Halcyon gave that information to Sienna Vale, who has spent the past 18 months building a relationship with Ronan specifically designed to get close enough to the accounts to drain them. She turned back to face the front. Her hands were in her lap and she looked at them. The bandaged right palm, the knuckles of the left. And she breathed. 8 months ago, a document photographed without full understanding of what it contained. 8 months ago, the mechanism of Ronan's financial destruction had been quietly handed over through a chain of people who each knew only their own piece of it. And somewhere in that chain, in a house she had managed and a staff she had hired and trusted with the ordinary texture of her daily life, the architecture of a crime had been built using access that ultimately traced back to her. Not to Ronan, to her. She had hired Reyes. The car was quiet. Outside, the city moved past the windows in the ordinary rhythms of an early morning. A bakery opening, a delivery truck double-parked, 2 men on a corner with coffee cups, existing in a world that had not burned down last night and did not know about Blackridge Manor or Gregor Soot or the 40% of a criminal empire currently flowing into accounts she needed to find. "Stop the car," she said. Cavell looked at her. "Pull over, now." He pulled to the curb. She got out. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning and she let herself have 30 seconds of it. The full weight of what she'd just understood. Reyes had been her hire. The breach had come through her household, her staff, her orbit. And the document that had enabled Sienna's access to the off-book accounts, she knew exactly what document it was. She knew because she had left it on that desk. She had printed it from a secure connection and reviewed it and left it face up for approximately 20 minutes before Ronan had come in to sign it. And in those 20 minutes, she had walked to the kitchen to bring coffee back, and Reyes had been in the West Wing that afternoon on a routine errand. 20 minutes. A document face up on a desk. A woman with a phone who filed everything. She stood on the sidewalk and felt the ground reorganize itself beneath her. She had not lit the fire at Blackridge Manor, but the key that had opened the door to everything that destroyed it had passed through her hands, and she had not known it, and the not knowing didn't change the fact. The driver's door opened. Cavell stood beside the car and looked at her across the roof. "Elena," he said. "I know." She looked at him. Her voice was the flattest it had been all night. "I know. This doesn't change the operational. It changes everything about the operational picture, and you know it." She moved back toward the car. "Because if Halcyon has been running an asset inside my household for 11 months, they have 11 months of information about me. My contacts, my patterns, my documentation." She stopped at the passenger door. "The record I told you I've been building for 3 years. They may know it exists." Cavell's jaw tightened, the first real tell she'd seen from him. "How exposed is it?" "Depends on what Reyes reported and when." She opened the door. "Which means we need to pull every piece of my documentation out of its current storage before Halcyon can move against it. And we need to do it in the next..." She checked the time. "We have 6 hours before the window closes on the account transfers. If we lose that documentation and we lose the financial trail simultaneously, we have nothing." She got in. Cavell got in. The car moved. From the back seat, Reyes's voice came forward, quiet, without inflection. "There's something else." Elena did not turn around. "Tell me." "When I reported the burner phone you used 8 weeks ago, when I flagged you as a potential complication." A pause. "The response I received from Sue was not to increase surveillance. It was to accelerate the timeline. He moved the operation up because of me. He moved it up because of you, yes. The original detonation date was 6 weeks from now. The Manor attack was pulled forward by 6 weeks because you were building something he couldn't fully see, and he decided the risk of waiting was too high." Elena absorbed that in silence. She had been moving carefully. She had been building quietly. She had been doing everything right, and it had made things worse. Her own careful preparation had been the thing that convinced Gregor Sue to act before he was ready, to move the operation forward, to detonate charges in a building with people still inside it. She had not known that. The not knowing, again. The cost of it. How complete was his preparation when he moved the timeline up? She asked. Not as complete as he wanted, Reyes said. The financial extraction through Vale was still 2 months from optimal. He moved anyway because the risk calculation changed. Which means the asset bleed is happening faster than Halcyon planned, Cavell said from the driver's seat, following the thread. They're pulling money out of a structure that wasn't fully compromised yet, which means they're leaving traces they would have cleaned up given more time. Which means the financial trail is trackable, Elena said, if we move fast enough. If, Cavell said. She looked at him. We move fast enough. Her phone buzzed. Not the burner, her actual phone, the one she'd had on her when the ceiling came down, which had cracked across the lower corner and still worked. A text from a number she recognized with a cold lurch of the stomach. It was Ronan's number. The text read, I know you're alive. We need to talk. I made a mistake. I need your help. She stared at the screen. In 12 years, she had never once received an admission of mistake from Ronan Viscari in any format. Not in person, not in writing, not implied. It was not in his vocabulary. The word mistake in his text message landed like something foreign, something he had had to look up, which meant he was very afraid. She turned the phone face down on her knee. Outside the window, the city continued its ordinary morning, oblivious, uncomplicated, moving in its own directions. She was not going to answer that text. Not yet. Not until she had what she needed, and what she needed was in a storage facility on the north side of the city, and the clock was running on whether Halcyon's people would reach it before she did, and the woman who had spent 11 months mapping her routines was sitting in the back seat of this car and might know the location. She turned around fully to face Reyes. The external storage I use, she said. Did you report it? Reyes met her eyes. In the flat morning light coming through the tinted windows, she looked exhausted in a way that had been hidden before. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for long enough that stopping it reveals everything that was underneath. I reported that you had one, Reyes said. I never found the location. Elena looked at her for a long moment, reading every micro-expression available to her. The set of the jaw, the tension around the eyes, the way the hands lay still on the knees, which was either the trained stillness of a professional or the genuine stillness of someone who had run out of the energy required to deceive. All right, Elena said. She turned back to the front. Cavell, we need to change vehicles. Then we go to the storage facility. A pause. And you need to increase the security around Cole Marsh, effective immediately. Soult will be clearing loose threads and Marsh is the most visible. Already in motion, Cavell said. Good. She looked at the road. Her leg was burning. Her hand was burning. Her mind was working with a cold, precise clarity that she recognized as the state she entered when everything external had been stripped away and only the essential problem remained. The essential problem was this. Halcyon had been inside her life for 11 months. They had used that access to engineer the collapse of an empire she had not chosen, but had lived inside of. They had moved their timeline up because they were afraid of her. They had tried to kill her, or had been willing to accept her death as collateral, because she had been building something they couldn't see and couldn't control. And now Ronan Viscari, the man who had left her to burn, was sitting somewhere in this city with his empire bleeding out around him, texting her the word mistake, needing her in the way that powerful men need things when they have run out of every other option. She knew what she was going to do. She had known, she thought, since she'd sat in the dark of that farmhouse kitchen reading the Halcyon files, since she'd felt the weight of 12 years of careful watching settle into something with a direction and a purpose. She was going to dismantle Halcyon Group's operation in this city completely, using the evidence she had built and the knowledge she carried and every contact and connection and piece of architectural understanding she had accumulated across 12 years of being underestimated. She was going to do it on her terms. And she was going to do it whether Ronan Viscari helped her or got in her way. Because the woman who had waited at the base of those stairs for him to come back and help her was in the ruins of Blackridge Manor, with the rest of the things that had burned, and what had walked out of the fire was something that did not wait anymore. The storage facility was a self-storage complex on the north side, the kind of place that advertised climate control and 24-hour access and asked no questions if the monthly payment arrived on time. Elena had rented the unit 3 years ago under a name that connected to her through 2 layers of legal distance, a small holding company she had established quietly through a lawyer Ronan had never met, using funds she had accumulated through a decade of careful personal financial management that existed entirely outside her husband's visibility. She had been building the exit before she knew she was building it. That was the thing she understood now, sitting in Cavell's second vehicle, a nondescript panel van that smelled like industrial cleaner, as they moved through the north side streets in the flat gray of early morning. She had been preparing for a life after Ronan Vescari, the way the body prepares for injury before impact, automatically, without conscious instruction, driven by something older than reason. The unit contained 3 things: a set of encrypted external drives with 12 years of documentation, financial records, correspondence transcripts, photographs, the meticulous record of a woman who had watched everything and trusted that what she saw would matter eventually. A secondary set of identity documents, legally clean, prepared through the same lawyer, belonging to a version of herself that had no connection to Blackridge Manor or the Vescari name, and a handgun she had purchased legally 5 years ago, registered to the holding company, cleaned and loaded and placed in a lockbox at the back of the unit, because she had understood even then that the day might come when she needed it. They reached the facility at 7:14 a.m. The gate was open. Cavell stopped the van half a block short, and they sat looking at it. The facility gate operated on a keycard system with a standard electromagnetic lock. It should not have been open at 7:14 in the morning. "How long?" Elena said. Cavell was already on his phone, checking the entry log. A pause. "Someone with a facility MasterCard accessed the gate at 6:52, 22 minutes ago." "Oh," Declan said from the back. "Or someone he sent." Cavell looked at Elena. "If they're inside, they may already be at the unit." "Then we move now." She reached for the door handle. "Elena!" She was already out. Her leg had gone from burning to a deep structural ache that lived in the bone and radiated upward with each step, the kind of pain that stops being sharp and becomes instead a constant companion you negotiate with rather than fight. She moved fast despite it, through the open gate, across the facility's main access lane, between the rows of orange-doored units toward the back corner where Unit 114 sat at the end of a row against the facility's perimeter wall. She could hear Cavell and Declan behind her. She didn't slow down. Unit 114's door was intact, padlock in place. She pulled out her key. She had worn it on her body since the night of the fire, on a chain under her shirt, because some habits were load-bearing. And she opened the lock and hauled the door up in one motion. Everything was there. She exhaled. One breath. Then she started pulling the drives. "Whoever came through the gate," Declan said from the doorway, "they either didn't find this unit, or they were inside and left." "Or they were never looking for the unit," Cavell said. He was scanning the access lane behind them. MasterCard access could be maintenance, could be coincidence. "There are no coincidences today," Elena said. She had the drives in a bag and the lockbox open. She took the handgun out, checked it, loaded, safety on, exactly as she'd left it, and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the identity documents in their envelope, made a decision, and put them in the bag too. "Let's go." They were back at the van in 4 minutes. She didn't let herself feel the relief of it. Relief was a loosening, and she needed to stay tight. Her phone buzzed again. Ronan. This time a call, not a text. She let it ring through. 20 seconds later, a text. "Sienna is moving the money. I can't stop it from my position. You can, please." She showed it to Cavell without comment. He read it and said, "He's right that she's moving it. We've been tracking the transfers and they're accelerating. The chain is going to complete in approximately..." He checked his phone. 4 hours. After that, the Terminus accounts go dark and we lose the trail entirely. "Where is she doing it from?" Elena said. "We think she's at the secondary property where Ronan is based." A pause. "With him." Elena looked out the windshield. The morning had fully arrived now. Flat white light, no warmth in it. The kind of November sky that couldn't decide between cloud and clearness and settled for both. He's watching her drain his accounts. He may not know the full extent yet. Cavell started the van. He reached out to you, which suggests he's losing his ability to track what's happening from inside. She's managing his visibility. Elena thought about it. Letting him see enough to feel like he's still operating while she controls what he can and can't access. She almost felt something that was not admiration and not respect, and was closest to the recognition of competence in an adversary. How many people does Suit have in the field right now? We've identified 4, possibly more we haven't located. And Halcyon's extraction timeline. When does Sienna need to be out? Based on the account movement pace, Cavell ran the math in his head. She needs approximately 6 hours to complete the financial extraction, which puts her departure window at around 2 p.m. today. Elena looked at the clock on the van's dashboard. 7:31. 6.5 hours. We need to find Sue, she said. Not after we deal with Sienna, before. Because if Sue is running the ground operation and Sienna is the financial mechanism, the moment we move against either one of them, the other one accelerates. We can't do them sequentially. We need simultaneous pressure. Cavell was quiet for a moment, driving. Then, that requires more people than we currently have positioned. Then get them positioned. She pulled out her phone and stared at Ronan's texts. And I need to talk to my husband. Well, they met Ronan at a diner 3 miles from the secondary property, because Elena refused to go to a location he controlled, and because a diner at 8 in the morning was full of ordinary people doing ordinary things and nobody would start anything violent in front of a waitress with a coffee pot in a Saturday morning crowd. Ronan came in alone. He had told her he would come alone and she had believed him, not because she trusted him, but because he was out of pieces to play, and he knew she knew it. He came through the door in clothes that weren't his, someone else's jacket, dark jeans, and he looked like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't, and he looked like a man who had spent the night watching his world close in from every direction, which he had. He saw her in the back booth and stopped for just a moment in the middle of the diner. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully categorize. Not regret, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that might have been regret if it had more experience expressing itself. He sat down across from her. She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully, the face she'd known for 12 years, the jaw she'd memorized, the eyes that she had once believed were capable of a kind of seeing that turned out to be only a very sophisticated form of assessment. "You're hurt," he said, looking at her hands. "I was on the floor of the East Corridor," she said. "You left me there." His jaw tightened. He looked at the table, then back at her. "I know. I'm not here about that." She kept her voice even. She had decided in the van that she would not spend any of the time she had on the thing between them. There wasn't enough time and it wouldn't resolve anything, and she needed him functional, not remorseful. "Tell me what you know about the account movements." He exhaled through his nose. "She has access I didn't give her. Accounts I haven't disclosed to anyone. They're moving. I tried to freeze the transfers, and the authorization pathways aren't responding to my credentials." He looked up. She changed the credentials. Sometime in the past 48 hours before the fire, she changed the authorization protocols on 3 of my primary accounts. The off-book ones. He went still. "How do you know about those?" "Ronan," her voice was flat. "I know about everything. That's why you texted me. Let's not perform surprise." She folded her hands on the table. "Sienna Vale is a Halcyon Group asset. She has been from the beginning. The ledger doesn't exist. It never did. She used it to get access to your operations, your trust, and ultimately your financial architecture. And she is currently in the process of moving approximately, what's the number?" He looked at her. Something in him had gone very still. 63 million liquid, more in asset-backed positions that can't be moved as quickly. She's taking the liquid and leaving the rest. Halcyon doesn't want the assets, they want the cash and the intelligence. The documentation of your operations that she's been building across 18 months. She paused. That documentation is what they'll use to position themselves to fill your territory once you're removed. He was staring at her. "The woman you ran upstairs to save," Elena said, "was the weapon that destroyed you." The words landed. She watched them land. She watched Ronan Veskari, who she had seen in every condition available to a human being over 12 years, absorb information that reconfigured everything he believed about the past 18 months of his life. His face did something complicated and then went very controlled. The control that came after the complicated thing, the enforced stillness of a man who could not afford what he was feeling. "What do you need from me?" he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Access to your remaining secure communication channels. The ones Sienna doesn't know about. And before you decide what to tell me, assume she knows about more than you think." She paused. "I also need you to keep her in place at the secondary property for the next 4 hours. Don't confront her. Don't let her know you know. Keep her believing the situation is recoverable and that you're working on it together. You want me to perform for her?" "I want you to do the thing you're best at," Elena said without inflection. "I want you to convince someone of something you don't believe." He looked at her across the table for a long time. Outside the diner windows, the street moved in its ordinary morning cadence, indifferent. "And after," he said, "when this is over, what happens to me?" She met his eyes. "That's not my decision to make." He nodded once, slow. The nod of a man settling a debt he can't pay but can at least acknowledge. "All right." Tip. The waterfront shipyard was Sue's. Cavell's people found it at 11:40 a.m., an abandoned commercial facility 3 miles from the port, decommissioned 8 years ago, currently owned through a shell that traced back through 6 layers of corporate distance to a Halcyon-affiliated investment vehicle registered in Luxembourg. It had been reactivated in the past month, power restored to specific sections, security installed that wasn't on any permit filing. Sue was running his ground operation from the facility's former supervisor building, a 2-story structure at the shipyard's interior that gave sightlines to every approach route. He had 4 confirmed personnel on site, possibly more in the surrounding structures. The plan, such as it was, ran on 3 simultaneous tracks. Cavell's people moved against the shipyard. Elena's documentation, the encrypted drives, the financial records, 12 years of accumulated evidence, went to the federal contacts Cavell had been maintaining at a distance for exactly this kind of moment, delivered with a cover letter that Elena wrote herself in 45 minutes in the back of the van, precise and damning and legally structured by someone who had spent 12 years understanding exactly how the law could be weaponized in either direction. And Ronan, performing for Sienna at the secondary property, kept the financial pipeline from going fully dark by feeding her carefully calibrated misinformation about his remaining account access, buying time in 4-hour increments. 3 tracks. All of them had to hold simultaneously or none of them worked. The shipyard assault began at 1:15 p.m. Elena was not supposed to be there. This had been stated clearly by Cavell and agreed to by Elena in the specific way she agreed to things she intended to revise when circumstances warranted, which was with a nod and complete silence on the subject of her actual intentions. She was there. She came in on the south approach with Declan and 2 of Cavell's field people, moving through the shipyard's outer section on foot, between the skeletal frames of decommissioned crane structures that rose against the November sky like the bones of something enormous. The ground was uneven, broken concrete, rusted rail lines running toward loading bays that hadn't operated in nearly a decade, standing water in the low spots that smelled like the bottom of things. Her leg was a wall of pain she was moving through by main force of will, and nothing else, and she didn't look at it, and she didn't think about it. The first crack of gunfire came from the north side of the facility, Cavell's people drawing Sue's perimeter attention. She moved south. The supervisor building's ground floor had 2 entrances, main door facing the interior yard, service entrance on the east face. She went for the service entrance with Declan at her shoulder, and the door was locked with a modern electronic deadbolt that was significantly more sophisticated than anything the original facility would have installed, which told her Sue took his security seriously in the places he actually occupied. Declan had a bypass device for the lock. It took 40 seconds that felt like a great deal longer, with gunfire continuing in short controlled bursts from the north perimeter and the wind coming off the water cutting through everything. The door opened. Inside, concrete floors, industrial lighting recently restored, the smell of coffee and machinery oil and human occupation. A corridor running toward a staircase. Elena went in with the gun out of her pocket and her heartbeat in her ears, present and loud and entirely real, the body's honest accounting of the situation. Declan checked left. She went right. The ground floor was clear. They went up. The second floor was where Soot worked. She knew it from the moment she reached the landing. There was a quality of organization to the space visible through the open interior door, the particular arrangement of a person who ran operations with military structure, tables with laptops, maps on the walls, communication equipment that was several tiers above what you'd expect from a criminal organization, because Halcyon was not a criminal organization in the traditional sense. It was something colder and more systematic, a machine for the controlled demolition of power structures, and its tools reflected that. And there, at the central table with a phone to his ear and his back to the door, was a man she had never seen before and recognized immediately from everything Cavell's files had told her about Gregor Soot. He was large, broad across the shoulders, heavy-boned, with close-cropped gray hair, and the posture of someone who had spent decades in situations where good posture was a survival tool. He was in his late 50s, she guessed. He was speaking in low, rapid German into the phone. He had not heard her come in. She crossed the room in 8 steps and pressed the muzzle of the handgun against the back of his skull and said, "Tell them it's handled and you'll call back." He went still, completely still, not the stillness of shock, but the trained stillness of someone who had been in this position before and knew how to calculate from inside it. He said something brief into the phone in German and ended the call and set the phone on the table. "Mrs. Vescari," he said in unaccented English. "Gregor Soot," she said. "You're more capable than my initial assessment suggested." He said it the way someone might remark on an unexpected weather development. "I should have moved the timeline even further up." "You moved it up because of me, and you still didn't move it enough." She reached around him with her free hand and took his phone off the table and stepped back, keeping the gun level. Hands flat on the table. He placed his hands flat. He turned his head slightly, not to look at her directly, but enough to catch her in his peripheral vision. "You understand that removing me from the operation doesn't stop it. The financial extraction is automated. Sienna Vale will complete her exit on schedule, regardless of what happens here." "Sienna Vale," Elena said, "is currently sitting in a room with my husband, who she believes is helping her manage the final phase of your operation. She is not aware that the communication she's been receiving from her Halcyon contacts for the past 3 hours has been filtered through channels that Cavell's people control." She paused. "She's been feeding misinformation back into your operation for 3 hours. The account transfers she believes are completing are being rerouted. The extraction is not going where she thinks it's going." Soot was quiet for a moment. "You turned the communication channels." 2 hours ago?" "Cavell," he said. Not a question. "Among others." She kept the gun steady. Her arm wanted to shake. Not from fear, but from the accumulated physical toll of the past 18 hours, the body presenting its bill. She did not let it shake. "You tried to kill me," she said. "You moved the detonation with me in that corridor." "A calculated risk," Soot said. "You were identified as a threat to the operation." "I want you to understand something." Her voice was very quiet. "The evidence I've submitted to federal contacts in the past 2 hours covers not just Ronan Vescari's financial operations, but Halcyon Group's complete methodology as I've been able to reconstruct it. The 4 regional collapses, the asset placement patterns, the corporate shell architecture you use to absorb territory after the primary power structure fails. That documentation is already delivered and beyond recall." She paused. "You're not going to be able to operate a version of this in this region, ever." Sue's hands were flat on the table. He said nothing. "Who authorized the detonation timing?" she said. "With me in the corridor." "Was that you directly, or did it come from the board?" A pause. "Me," he said. "Then we're done talking." She looked at Declan in the doorway. "Secure him." Declan crossed the room. And in the 3 seconds between Elena stepping back and Declan reaching Sue, Soot moved. He was fast in a way that large men sometimes were. Fast and economical, no wasted motion, the movement of someone who had trained the reaction into reflex. His right hand came off the table and connected with Declan's forearm before Declan was fully in range. redirecting the grab, and his body turned and he drove an elbow back toward Elena with a force that would have caught her in the throat if she hadn't already been moving sideways, which she was, because she had watched his shoulders, and his shoulders had tensed 2 seconds before he moved and she had filed it. The elbow caught her across the right cheekbone instead of the throat. She went down. Not unconscious. The impact snapped her head sideways and dropped her to one knee, and her vision went white at the edges and her cheek exploded with heat, but she was not unconscious. She had the gun in her hand. She brought it up from the floor. Salt had Declan between himself and her now, not using him as a shield exactly, more using the geometry of the situation, the tangled space of two people who had collided and were recovering. He was moving for the door. Sult. Her voice came from the floor, flat, absolute. He stopped. He looked back at her, at the gun leveled at him from below, at her on one knee on the concrete with blood from her cheekbone starting to track down her face, holding the weapon with both hands because that was what you did when your hands were trying to shake. He looked at her for a moment that held everything. Then Cavell's people came through the north stairwell door, and the moment ended. They brought Sienna out of the secondary property at 2:40 p.m. Elena was there for it. She had driven to the property, against Cavell's explicit advice, which she heard and processed and set aside, because there were things you needed to witness yourself and could not outsource. Sienna Vale came out of the building between two of Cavell's people, and she looked exactly as Elena had imagined she would. Composed, unhurried, wearing her beauty and her poise like armor. Even now, even with her operation dismantled and her extraction route closed and the account she'd spent 18 months penetrating now flowing in the wrong direction. She walked without being dragged. She held her head level. She saw Elena standing by the vehicle and stopped. The two women looked at each other for the first time. Sienna was striking. That was the honest word, striking in the way of someone who had weaponized their appearance through enough discipline that it had become something more than appearance, a quality of attention command that went beyond features or form. Elena had understood this intellectually. Seeing it in person was different. Seeing it in person while standing with a bruising cheekbone and a wrapped leg and 18 hours of damage visible on her body and face, different. She did not look away. I was told, Sienna said, and her voice was exactly what Elena had expected it to be. Low, calibrated, the voice of someone who had never once spoken without purpose, that you weren't a factor. I know, Elena said. You told him that yourself. Something moved in Sienna's face, the first crack in the composure, not large, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture at the corner of her careful expression. How long have you known about me? Long enough, Elena paused. You were very good, the patience of it, the construction. You were very good. But you made the same mistake Ronan made. Elena held her eyes. You looked at me and you decided I was furniture. A beat. People who make that assessment tend to find out what the furniture was actually holding up. Sienna held her gaze for one more moment. Then she looked away, not in defeat exactly, but in the manner of someone closing a chapter. Cavell's people moved her to the vehicle. From the building's doorway, Ronan appeared. He had been inside when they brought Sienna out, had watched through a window, Elena suspected, because he did not come out until she was already in the vehicle and the door was closed. He came down the front steps slowly and stopped several feet from Elena and looked at her with the particular look of a man who has spent the past several hours doing exactly what was asked of him and has now run out of assigned tasks and doesn't know what his face should do. It's done? He asked. The financial extraction is stopped. The evidence is submitted. Sue is in custody. She paused. Your empire is not recoverable. I want to be direct about that. His jaw worked. I know. The federal contacts who received my documentation this morning, they'll be in touch with you before tonight. She looked at him. Cooperate. Fully and without reservation. It's the only option that doesn't end in a way from which there is no return. He nodded. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her at the base of the stairs, with that profile view quality. The face turned toward her, but something in the eyes still processing, still running numbers. Except the numbers were different now. She could see that. Whatever calculation he'd run at the base of those stairs was not the one running now. Elena, he said. She waited. He stopped. Started again. There isn't a word for it. What I did. No, she agreed. There isn't. She looked at him for a moment, at the face she had memorized over 12 years, at the jaw and the cut of the brow, and the eyes that she had once believed saw her fully and had learned saw her selectively, and then not at all. She felt the full weight of 12 years. She let herself feel it, not to punish herself with it, but to honor it, to give it its proper mass before she set it down. Then she turned and walked to the vehicle where Declan was waiting. Behind her, she heard Ronan say something, too low to make out, possibly not directed at her, possibly just the sound of a man accounting to himself in a language he'd never quite learned. She got in the vehicle. "Where to?" Declan said. She pressed 2 fingers carefully against her bruised cheekbone, felt the heat there, the beginning of serious swelling. She breathed through the pain of her leg. She looked at her wrapped palm and the faint blood stain that had come through the gauze from the cheekbone hit. Outside the window, the November sky had finally decided. Clouds, flat and complete, pressing down on the city without drama. The kind of sky that was simply weather, simply the day continuing in its ordinary direction. "I need a place to sleep for 4 hours," she said, "and then I need to talk to the federal contact directly, not through intermediaries." She paused. "And someone needs to check on Cole Marsh." "Already done," Declan said. "He's safe." She nodded. The vehicle moved. Somewhere across the city, in the waterfront shipyard with its rusted cranes and broken concrete and the smell of salt and old machinery, the last of Gregor Sue's operation was being dismantled piece by careful piece by people who had been waiting a long time for the conditions to be right. And the conditions had been made right, not by Cavell's organization or by the federal apparatus or by any of the conventional forces arrayed against Halcyon Group, but by a woman who had spent 12 years being told she was not a factor, and who had used every single one of those years to build something that no one had seen coming because no one had been paying attention to the right person. She closed her eyes. The vehicle moved through the gray afternoon, carrying her forward, and the city outside did what cities do, continued, indifferent, vast, entirely unaware that somewhere in its ordinary geography, something had just finished that had taken 12 years to build and 18 hours to finally, completely, and irrevocably burn. She slept for 4 hours and 19 minutes in a room she didn't know, in a building she'd never been in before, on a bed that was clean and narrow and completely without history. And when she woke, the light through the window had changed from flat gray to the darker gray of early evening, and for exactly 3 seconds she did not remember where she was or what had happened. Then she did. She lay still for a moment and let her body report its damage without trying to manage it. The cheekbone had swollen significantly. She could feel the tightness of it without touching it, the way a bruise of that depth occupied space and made itself known. The leg had stiffened in sleep to something that would require serious persuasion to move. The palm was manageable. The rest of it, the accumulated physical debt of 18 hours of sustained crisis, lived in her muscles and her joints as a deep generalized exhaustion that was not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, but something more structural, the tiredness of a body that had been asked to keep going past the point where it should have stopped and had complied without being given the option to do otherwise. She sat up. She put her feet on the floor. She stood. The room had a small bathroom attached. She went into it and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The woman in the mirror had a bruise covering most of her right cheekbone and beginning to purple its way toward the eye socket. She had gauze on her right palm and a visible weariness in the set of her face that was not the kind of weariness that sleep fixes. Her hair was wrong, and her clothes were the same ones she'd been wearing since before the fire, and there was a faint rust-colored mark on the collar of her shirt that she looked at for a moment before understanding it was blood, dried, from the cheekbone when Sue had caught her. She washed her face, carefully, around the bruise. Cold water, which was a small shock that clarified things. She looked at herself again. She had been trying to identify what she felt, and the honest answer was that she felt very little that was clean or nameable. There was something that was not quite relief. The operation had worked, the evidence was submitted, Sue was in custody, Sienna's extraction had been stopped, and Ronan Vescari was in a federal building somewhere being confronted with the organized documentation of his own criminal career. but the thing she felt in the proximity of all that was not the relief of a finished fight. It was something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of standing in a room where something very large used to be and finding only the outline it left on the walls. She dried her face, went back into the bedroom, found the bag with the drives and the identity documents where she'd left it on the floor by the bed, sat on the edge of the mattress and held the bag in her lap for a moment. 3 years of building the record. 12 years of watching and learning and filing and waiting. And in the end, it had worked the way she'd needed it to work. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without damage to people she'd tried to protect, and things she hadn't been able to anticipate. But it had worked. The structure was dismantled. The people who had built it were in custody or compromised. The territory Halcyon had tried to absorb was, for the moment, ungoverned rather than misgoverned, which was not ideal but was better than the alternative. She thought about Reyes. Reyes was in federal custody too, had surrendered formally at 2 p.m. at Cavell's arrangement, with a cooperation agreement in place that would substantially reduce her exposure in exchange for complete disclosure of her Halcyon contacts and operational history. Elena had been the one to tell Cavell to arrange the agreement. She had thought about that choice carefully and had made it without sentiment. Reyes had provided information that had materially advanced the operation, and she was 28 years old and had been recruited by an organization that specialized in finding people with specific vulnerabilities and specific skill sets and making them offers that obscured the full cost of acceptance. That didn't absolve her. It contextualized her. Context mattered. And she had told the truth in the container terminal about not reporting the storage facility's location. Elena believed that. She wasn't entirely sure why she believed it. It might have been accurate reading, or it might have been what she'd needed to believe to keep moving. She had made the call, and she would live with it. She heard a knock at the door. 3 taps, light and precise. "Come in, Declan," she said. He came in looking marginally less composed than he had at any earlier point in the past 18 hours, which for Declan meant that one button on his jacket was undone. He carried 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the nightstand beside her without asking if she wanted it. "How's the face?" he said. "Educational." She picked up the coffee. "Report." He sat in the room's single chair. Sol is being processed through federal holding. His lawyer arrived at 4 p.m., which means Halcyon's board knows what happened and is managing exposure. We expect they'll try to distance themselves from the ground operation and characterize Sue as an independent operator. He paused. "The documentation you submitted makes that position very difficult to maintain." "Good." "Sienna Vale is in a separate federal facility. She's not cooperating. Her lawyer is also Halcyon adjacent, which the federal team is aware of and is treating accordingly." He looked at her. "She asked, through her lawyer, whether you would be willing to speak with her." Elena looked at the coffee cup in her hands. "No." "That's what I told them you'd say." "What about the financial recovery?" She looked up. "The diverted transfers. 61 of the 63 million has been traced and frozen. The remaining 2 million moved through a clean enough chain that it's going to take some time to locate. The federal financial team is optimistic." He paused. "None of it goes back to Ronan, obviously. It becomes evidence." "Obviously." She drank the coffee. It was very hot and she didn't care. "Cole Marsh. Relocated to his sister's property in another state. Transportation arranged. New employment reference prepared through one of Cavell's legitimate business fronts. He's aware of why, and he said to tell you he hopes you're all right." Declan's expression shifted slightly on that last part, the closest thing to warmth she'd seen from him. He said it twice. She nodded, set the cup down. "And Ronan." The pause that followed was longer than the others. "He's been in federal interview for approximately 6 hours, Declan said. He's cooperating, fully and without reservation, which is apparently surprising to the agents involved, given the degree of entrenched resistance they usually encounter with operators at his level." Another pause. His attorney told the lead agent that Viscari came in with a prepared statement of intent to cooperate, that he'd been told to do so and had decided it was correct. Elena said nothing. "He asked to see you," Declan said. "Once. He made the request through his attorney and then withdrew it before anyone could respond." She absorbed that. "He withdrew it himself." Yes. She understood that. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd done in years, asking and then withdrawing the ask, which was the behavior of a man who had understood that certain things couldn't be requested, could only be offered, and who had finally, at the end of everything, stopped trying to acquire what wasn't available for acquisition. What's Cavell's position on ongoing exposure? She said. For me specifically. Declan straightened slightly. Halcyon will know your role in what happened. The board may consider a retaliation posture, but the documentation you've submitted creates significant legal risk for them if anything happens to you now. You're more valuable to them alive and non-targeted than the alternative. He paused. Cavell recommends a period of relocation, somewhere without established connections. He has resources that can facilitate. I know. She looked at the bag on her lap, the envelope inside it with the clean identity documents, the drives with 12 years of her watching the world and keeping the record. I've been planning for relocation for 3 years. I don't need Cavell's resources for that. She looked up at Declan. Tell him I'm grateful for the safe house and the transport and the field support. Tell him I know what it cost and I'll remember it. Declan nodded. He'll know that means you're not coming into a formal arrangement with him. He'll know it means I'm not coming into anything with anyone for a while. She stood up. The leg was bad but functional, and functional was what mattered. I need to make one stop before I leave the city. The federal building was a concrete tower in the civic district, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of structure that communicated institutional authority through sheer aggregate weight of material. Elena arrived at 6:40 p.m. in a car Declan had arranged, and she went in through a side entrance with the assistance of a junior agent named Ferris, who had been assigned as her liaison, and who was young enough that he hadn't yet learned to keep his reaction to her appearance off his face, the bruise, the bandaged hand, the leg that made her walk the way she walked. She met with the lead federal agent, a woman named Carver, in a conference room on the 3rd floor. Carver was in her mid-40s, direct, with the manner of someone who had processed a great many people in a great many configurations of guilt and innocence, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. They sat across from each other at a table that was designed for this, for the space between a person and the accounting they owed for the shape of their life. The documentation you submitted is extensive, Carver said, and substantially organized. That level of organization over that time period is not the work of someone who didn't understand what they were witnessing. I understood what I was witnessing, Elena said, which raises the question of what you did and didn't know and when. I expected that question. I've prepared a full personal disclosure. She took a document from the bag, not the drives, a separate document, hand-printed, organized by year and subject matter. Everything I knew, when I knew it, and what actions I took. I made choices over 12 years that I'm not going to defend or diminish. I managed the domestic infrastructure of a criminal operation, and I was aware of its general nature. I did not participate in its planning or execution, and I have no criminal record. I also built the record that brought you Halcyon Group's methodology in documented form. She placed the document on the table. I expect the disclosure will earn me the protections I've requested. If it doesn't, I expect to hear that directly. Carver looked at the document, then at Elena. She had good eyes, observant, measuring, the eyes of someone who made their living reading the distance between what people said and what was true. She read Elena for a moment. The protections you requested are granted, Carver said. Full immunity from prosecution based on disclosed prior knowledge, a formal witness status designation, and the relocation assistance your liaison outlined. She paused. In exchange for full cooperation and availability for testimony if the cases against Viscari and the Halcyon principals proceed to trial. Agreed, Elena said. They looked at each other across the table for a moment, 2 women in a concrete room accounting for things in the most direct available language. Off the record, Carver said. Elena waited. How long did you know it was going to end this way? Elena thought about that honestly. About the burner phone and the external storage and the lawyer she'd found without Ronan's knowledge and the document she'd placed in the holding company's name 3 years ago. About the long, slow accumulation of preparation that she hadn't been able to name as preparation while she was doing it. I didn't know it would end this way specifically, she said. I knew it would end. Carver nodded. Carver, a small nod, the kind that means the answer was the expected one, and also the only honest one. "We'll be in touch through the liaison," she said, and stood and offered her hand. Elena shook it, her burned palm against Carver's uninjured one, the contact brief and dry and professional. She left the building at 7:22 p.m. She went back to Blackridge Manor. She didn't have a reason for it that she could have defended to Cavell or Declan or anyone else who would have tried to talk her out of it. She went because there are things you have to see with your own eyes before you can fully put them behind you, and she had not seen it in daylight, had not seen what remained, had only seen the fire. The estate road was blocked with temporary fencing and yellow tape and signage from the fire marshal's office. Standard post-structure fire isolation, the legal protection of a site still under investigation. She parked on the verge of the estate road and got out and stood at the fence line. What was left of Blackridge Manor was not dramatic. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She'd expected ruin, to look like ruin, to have the Gothic quality of collapsed arches and dramatic shell walls and the picturesque devastation of things that had once been grand. Instead, it looked like what it was, which was a building that had burned and left behind the unsentimental residue of combustion. Blackened structural elements, collapsed sections that had folded inward rather than outward. The marble of the exterior facade still largely standing in the east section, but scorched to an even gray that made it look like something from another century entirely. The west facade, where she'd entered and exited 100 times, the columns, the carved lintel, was still standing. The windows were gone. Through the empty frames, she could see the sky on the other side of the building. She stood at the fence for a while. She thought about a Thursday night 12 years ago when she'd walked through those doors for the first time as the person who would live there, and she'd stood in the entrance hall with its obscene chandelier and its marble floor, and had actually thought, she remembered it clearly, that she was beginning something, that she was at the opening of a chapter of her life that had not yet declared itself fully, that she was walking into the middle of a story and didn't know yet what the story was. She knew now. She did not feel grief for the house. She had thought she might, and she didn't, which was its own kind of information. The house had been a place she lived, not a place she was. The distinction she'd failed to make for years, the confusion of proximity with belonging that had cost her more than she was able to fully calculate standing here at a fence line looking at scorched marble. She felt something else instead, something that was not relief and not grief, and not the cold structural emptiness she'd felt when she'd first understood the full shape of what had happened. Something quieter than all of those. She felt the end of something. Not her. She was clear about that, clearer than she'd been about anything in years. She was not ending. She was doing what she'd been doing in some form since she'd lain on the floor of that corridor and felt the heat of the fire through the marble, and decided, without framing it as a decision, that she was going to get out of this. She was continuing. What was ending was the version of her life that had been structured around a man and his world and the slow diminishment of self that came with making yourself fit a space not designed for you. That was done. She turned away from the fence. She walked back to the car on a damaged leg in the darkening evening, and she opened the door and put the bag on the passenger seat. The drives, the documents, 12 years of careful watching. And she sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel and looked at the road ahead. The city existed in all directions. Beyond the city, other cities, other versions of what a life could look like if you built it from the right foundation with the right materials, if you made the choices that were yours to make rather than the ones that were assigned to you by someone else's understanding of your value. She had money, not Viscari money. She was clear-eyed about not touching anything connected to the operation, both legally and in terms of the woman she intended to be going forward. But her own money, the quiet accumulation of 12 years of careful personal management, enough to relocate and establish and live without urgency while she figured out the shape of what came next. She had the knowledge. The 12 years of it, not the criminal architecture, but the skill set underneath. How to pay attention, how to read people and situations, and the distance between what was said and what was true, how to build a long, careful plan and hold it through the pressure of circumstances that tried to collapse it. That knowledge was hers. It had always been hers. She had developed it inside a life that tried to make her invisible, and it had survived that, and it would be useful in the next life in ways she could not yet fully see. She had the clean documents in the envelope. She had a lawyer who didn't know Ronan Viscari and a holding company that had never been connected to his name. She had the specific kind of freedom that comes not from the absence of history, but from the presence of a history fully accounted for. Every choice documented, every debt acknowledged, every piece of it laid out in a federal building and given its proper name. She started the car. She drove north out of the city, on a highway that led to other highways, through the dark that was not threatening but simply the ordinary dark of an evening in November. The world doing what the world did, indifferent and vast and full of the possibility that indifference makes available to people willing to move into it. She drove for 2 hours before she stopped. A small motel at the edge of a town she didn't know the name of, with a vacancy sign and a parking lot with 3 other cars in it, and a woman at the desk who gave her a key without asking her name, which the sign-in register made optional, and who returned to her television program without looking up again. Elena carried the bag to the room. The room was clean and plain and without history, exactly like the room she'd woken in that afternoon, and she understood that this was what the next period of her life would look like. Rooms without history, in places without previous associations, learning the shape of herself without a reference structure she'd been leaning against for so long that she'd forgotten what standing fully upright felt like. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her shoes and held them in her hands for a moment. The shoes she'd been wearing when the ceiling came down, still carrying a faint gray dust from Blackridge Manor's marble floors that hadn't fully brushed off. She set them by the door. She opened the bag and took out the drives and set them on the nightstand. Took out the envelope with the documents and opened it and looked at the name printed on the identification inside. Her real name. The name before Viscari, the name she'd been born with and had set aside when she'd married into a different identity. She had chosen to file the clean documents in that name rather than a fictional one, which had felt important at the time of doing it and felt more important now. She was still herself. She put the documents back in the envelope and set it beside the drives and turned off the light. She lay in the dark for a while without sleeping, not restlessly, just present, just inhabiting the quiet, letting the day finish itself around her. She thought about Cole Marsh at his sister's property, safe and relocated, living the ordinary continuation of a life that he'd almost had taken from him for the simple act of coming back for someone who was screaming. She thought about Declan and his economical loyalty, which had cost him nothing to give and had mattered more than he probably knew. She thought about Carver, across a table in a concrete building, reading her with those good measuring eyes and granting the protections that were fair in exchange for what was owed. She thought about Ronan, not with anger. She had expected anger to be there, waiting for her at the end of the day's motion, and it wasn't. What was there instead was something more like the weight of an accurate accounting. 12 years of a person you knew completely, including the parts that disappointed you and the parts that were genuinely good and the parts that were simply his, neither good nor bad, just the texture of who he was. All of that didn't disappear because it had ended badly. It was real. The life was real. The choice he made on those stairs was real, and the choice he'd made today to cooperate fully without negotiating or maneuvering was also real. And both of those things could be true simultaneously without either one canceling the other out. She had loved him. She thought she had. Something that was called love, anyway. Something that had the architecture of it, if not always the full interior. She had given 12 years of genuine attention and care to a person who had looked at her in the worst moment and decided she was worth less than a document that didn't exist. She held that, gave it its full weight, set it down. She was not going to spend the next part of her life being the woman who had been left in the fire. That story was accurate, and it was finished, and it was not who she was. It was one thing that had happened to a person who was significantly more than the worst thing that had happened to her. She had demonstrated that over 18 hours in ways she hadn't needed to demonstrate to anyone else in order for them to be true. She closed her eyes. Outside the motel, the highway ran in both directions through the ordinary dark. Trucks passed at long intervals, the sound of them building and fading, the Doppler drift of something moving with purpose through a world that was simply itself, neither hostile nor welcoming, just the context in which things happened. She slept. In the morning, she woke before the light came and lay still for a moment and thought, today is the first day that has nothing in it yet. Then she got up. She showered and dressed And she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, and the face that looked back was damaged and tired and wearing 12 years and one catastrophic night in every line around the eyes. And it was also her face. The face she'd had before the Vescari name and would have after. The face of a woman who had paid attention and built a record and survived the thing she was always going to have to survive one way or another. She gathered the bag. She went to the door and picked up her shoes, the ones with the gray marble dust still in their treads. And she looked at them for a moment, and then she set them back down by the door and went to the closet where there was a pair of simple flat shoes, the motel's courtesy amenity for guests who needed them, in a basket with other forgotten or donated things. They fit. She left the old shoes where they were. She walked out into the morning, which was cold and clear and without drama. Just light coming up over flat ground, just the world beginning its ordinary rotation, just the first day of a life that had not yet decided what it was going to be and was therefore available to become anything she was willing to build it into. She put the bag in the passenger seat. She looked at the road. She drove.